thank you very much to MLA for the invite to be here today. And it is great to be in Queensland and to hear about the amazing opportunities in front of you. And you are all the key people in the room, it appears, that can make change and turn those challenges into opportunities. So to reflect, I think one of the questioners, wow, it's been a very insightful and interesting session to date. But what I want to talk to you about is a different form of disruption, and to continue the theme of disruption and not to burden you too much, because I feel that you might be thinking we're a bit over disruption by now. Can we go back to how things are at the moment? But I want to talk to you today so that you can consider the impact of this disruption on your outcomes and moving forward today. And that is, I'm going to talk about this area of disruption to help with your journey. And the disruption that I'm talking about is the disruption in the agricultural knowledge and innovation system itself. And it might be a slower form of disruption, something that's perhaps going under the radar. But it's about how decision-making is supported at the farm level. It's the way science comes to benefit producers, consumers, and the environment and the society. So this disruption has been a slow burn. It's come from a combination of reduced government investment in the extension and advisory system, come from changes in the commercialisation and privatisation of advice. It's come from consumers. We've heard today the value chain and that focus and how that's driving change in farming systems. And this has then changed the signals around welfare, around reproduction, around feeding. Advances in technology, we've heard all about that today. But this has an impact on how well is the advisory and information system operating to help us in this future that we've said is coming and we want to be part of. Is the extension and advisory system working and working for the future? So to kick this off, I wanted to share with you some findings about this question, about the advisory and information system that has come from a project through the Rural R&D for Profit program that MLA is a partner in. The information about the detail of the project is there and on the website. And it's about what perhaps is coming from these findings, what it might mean for your sector and how it relates to the genetic and breeding and adoption challenges. So we conducted a national survey of producers. And this map shows where responses and the sample came from, and the details of the method and the references, etc., are in other reports. But I just wanted to show and thank you for particularly the Queensland respondents to the national survey about the use of information, advice and support. So what I've done with the national sample of 1,000 producers, and that has a relatively low margin of error, what I've done is taken out some of the key findings that really relate to the livestock sector from this survey. And we asked a number of attitudinal questions related to the appetite for change, the extent of new practices, and I just wanted to report some of the just really top-level findings from this study, just the average of findings, and talk a bit about what that might mean for going forward in this area of interest. So we asked a question about how important it is for you as a producer to really be identifying these new opportunities. So making the most of things like that was discussed today. And we found a high level, majority agreement across sheep, meat, wool and beef around the importance of opportunities. And I think we can hear it today in the questions of producers about where is this opportunity that you're talking about, how does that fit with me? And we found that there's increasing demand over the next 5 years, with 31% of livestock farms expected to increase their use of information, advice and support services in that time. However, currently there's a really low certainty about where to access the information and advice and support that producers say they need. And this has got to be a concern. It's got to be a concern if we're trying to use knowledge and information to really support profitable, sustainable outcomes. There was also suggestions of feeling pressure around being able to reduce cost of productions. That's playing in the minds of producers. We found about the type of information and support that was desired was around specific technical information and problem solving, and ways to increase productivity, profitability and sustainability, and to be keeping up to date and to knowing what's new. So what did we find about farmers' sources of information, advice and support? We were particularly interested and developed a typology of the different types of organisations and groups that were there that producers were drawing on. So we looked at government, we looked at research and development corporations or industry groups that reflect a public-private mix. We looked at product resellers, farm input suppliers. We looked at independent fee-for-service advisors. We know in many sectors, this is a cross-sectoral study, that the farmer-owned groups, the information, advice and support organisations that come together to really benefit members are a key group. Also the processing companies, which are very important for your sector, and their role in the information advisory and support system. We also included groups such as not-for-profits and community-oriented groups that are starting to emerge internationally as groups that producers are going to. So we looked at this categorisation and examined the way these organisations were playing their part by asking farmers who they used for information, advice and support. So here on the graph, there are two bars. So first of all, we asked an open question, and this is specifically for the livestock sector here, this graph. We asked a specific question about who do you use overall, and then we went into more detail and asked them to nominate a main source of information, advice and support for farming. Here what we find is the product resellers and farm input suppliers. 82% of producers said that they used and valued and trusted this form of advice. And you can see the percentage use down the list. Product resellers for this sector were a main source for 23% of the producers, the one that people said they nominated as most important to them. And we can see there that the next one in the brackets there, the independent fee-for-service advice, that 20% of producers were relying on this source. Just to go down on the fee-for-service angle a little, is that we're able to generate more information about the annual expenditure on fee-for-service advice in all the sectors. And so I bring this one up here around beef and sheep meat, sheep wool, and around the average annual spend. Now, from a producer side, you might be saying, oh yes, that could be on average, depending on my average size, that reflects quite well. But what's really interesting is actually the bottom figure, which is the number of advisors that are used. So here we've got from 2.1 to 2.3, because it's an average, of fee-for-service advisors used. So one is you have to ask about the alignment of the advice, but the other thing, you've got to look from the advisor side, because we also surveyed advisors, and consider that an advisor that's working in the livestock sector has to have double or triple the number of clients than, say, for in the grains and cropping sector. So on a system level, these are some of the considerations for the strength of the system or otherwise. So we can see that there's a range of players that influence farm decision making. So the next or remaining question you might have is, but what about practice change? What about adoption? Are these relationships between trusted source of advice creating change? And what we can say from the overall study is absolutely. So we provided an opportunity for each respondent to talk about the types of change, write down the types of change that they attribute to their sources of advice. And we had 954 out of 1,003 talking about the changes they'd made. And those changes were around farm practices, inputs and products, the farm business, and infrastructure and machinery and equipment. And just the size of the boxes there is just the sheer number of comments related to these things. And some of them specifically aligned to some of the key trends that industry's seeking. So for instance, in the livestock sector, farmers spoke a lot about practice changes, and they said that following advice, changes to animal health, or pasture management or breeding criteria were most common changes that they related to this work with their trusted advisors. So before moving on to that, what we can see is that there are a large number of groups that are supporting change. We can't really say that there's a monopoly on change. Not one organisation is responsible for adoption or practice change. It's now a shared responsibility across all these different players, and it's something that to actually achieve the change that you're talking about is something that's absolutely critical, engaging all those players. So then you might say, yep, we've been engaging different people from the whole value chain in thinking about better information, advice and support. But when we did survey the advisors, and I've only got this one slide from the advisor survey, we've revealed a whole other set of information about the advisory or information advisory sector. We found that 70% of advisors surveyed said they were basically disconnected from the RD&E system, that they wanted a lot more involvement. So you asked them how connected they were and then how much they wanted to be, and this is the result around what they wanted to be. They desire to be involved in things like being kept up to date on where things are at in the sector, like today. About actually being involved in the translation of research outputs, actually being involved in research priority setting and the design, development and delivery of extension projects and programs. So this is good news. People want to be engaged in a collective effort to support the change desired. So let's just do a bit of a recap. There's increasing demand from farms for information, advice and support, but there's uncertainty about really where to go. And it's a high level of uncertainty, and there's lots of pressures. There are trusted advisors that are having an impact on practice change, but these advisors are distributed across a huge range of organisations. We have a fragmented knowledge system. And then all today, you've just told me that there's a much more complex environment for decision making coming, some to simplify, to make things easier and more profitable, but it's going to require a whole new way of doing things, and definitely a different way than how things are done at the moment. And we have a large number of the advisory and information services, these intermediaries that help translate between farm practice and research, disconnected from what we're trying to achieve or do. So this is disruption. It's a form of disruption, and the other type of disruption that we've heard of today is only going to make things harder. So, what's required then? Is there a way forward? You've got a great opportunity, but from what I heard today, a fact sheet isn't going to cut it on the type of change you're describing. We've talked about whole system change, whole value change here. So then what does a culture of adoption look like? I'm going to suggest to you that actually the culture is one of co-innovation. Look, that's could be considered an academic term, but basically it means if we don't work together, we're screwed. Co-innovation. And partly it's about the type of challenge you've presented or I've listened to today. We're dealing with complex problems here, changes of 40 years of patterns of way things are done to new ways. Some of it's going to be forced because it's there in the market. There's things that people are taking opportunities from. But we can't use the same processes of adoption, of technology transfer, of one solution for everybody anymore. We've talked about needing to adapt our systems and for the science to adapt. Even the last session talking about how the scientists are trying to adapt as well to the challenges and needs of the farming systems. So what's needed now is an approach like what's been started with the consortium and a real rethinking of how things are being done. Thank you. So I just wanted to give a couple of insights, and I can see that the slide pack was an old slide pack. So I had updated it. I just want to talk a little bit about the dairy journey. Dairy's been talked about a bit. The dairy industry has been on a journey of co-innovation over at least 10 years. They needed to look at the national breeding objectives and they needed to re-engage the farming population. There was a wave of discontent that was happening around the Australian system, and there's a number of people in the room that can talk more about the specifics of the journey. But it required everybody to go on a journey of what a modern genetic evaluation system would look like. And it's come up with 3 new indices. And the important point that I'd like to make here is a scientific paper in the Journal of Dairy Science that talks about the indices being developed from bioeconomic principles, from patterns of farmer preferences for traits and desired gains approaches. It was about the engagement of the farmers and their needs through the whole journey. There's a lot of social research, there's a lot of industry engagement. There was an Australia's longest farm walk from far north Queensland through to Tasmania, walking in herds and talking about what was important for different types of herds and systems. So they took a co-innovation approach. And an example of the farmer champion, or one of the farmer champions, saying, love it or hate it, everyone has an opinion about the APR, whether it's the Australian Profit Ranking in dairy. So let's have this conversation and come on this longest farm walk and work out a new system. And then the extension leader here has been there all the way through and kept the engagement going over more than a decade, and says in a recent paper here, presented at the International or the World Genetics Conference in New Zealand last week, the challenge for research teams and evaluation units will be to find novel ways of validating traits that both farmers and industry can relate to. This may be delivering tools that enable farmers to validate on farm or by proactively extending validation research outcomes. It's important to consider both the farmer and industry acceptance of indices that support increased rates of genetic gain. So a co-innovation journey in dairy that you can get insight to about how to address some of the challenges you've described. in the Victorian lamb industry, and a PhD study, and Erica is here in the room today, has found through a lot of interviews with producers from all across the chain, plus all the intermediaries, that still long-term social relationships are important. Stock agents and ram breeders are key actors. The value of change is a real debate, and how that might be preventing or impacting the use of ASBVs. So the importance of co-innovation, bringing people along in the journey. So to conclude, a culture change and a culture for adoption means that all the groups that are influencing decision making need to be part of the journey and strongly engaged. Clear and straightforward messages about what the benefit is of taking opportunities need to be very clear. And the importance of farmer leaders that have already been talked about today to listen and engage farmers in the journey of change. And really, the representation in this room represents a real start. So the title of my presentation was about will you play your part? And what we've seen from some of the examples and to address some of the challenges you've described is that it really is about a whole new engagement across the sector. It might need some giving of ground, and we've seen, for instance, even in the dairy, the negotiations and debates between geneticists and extra selection indices. Everybody gave a little bit of ground to achieve the better outcome. Putting your hand up to collaborate, I presume that everybody here in the room's already done that. And it's about a time and money to make the change. I just want to finish on that point. If I look at what I've heard today, that the goal is pretty clear. I think the timeline's too short. It's 5 years for making the type of change you're talking about. And I have not seen anything. Everyone's been talking about the gain, the $1 billion gain, but not what you're going to invest in this process of change to get that gain. And that would be a great point for your tables discussion. Thanks very much.